Today we're going to talk about onions. So onions are something that I have tried a bunch of different things with, and I'm going to tell you the ways that I've learned to use them, and what was in particular a game changer for my household. So onions are pretty easy to grow in the sense of you will always get something that tastes like an onion from starting an onion. You might have difficulty getting it to bulb. There's a whole bunch of different things that goes into that for growing. You can grow onions from seed, which is my favorite way to do it. You can also purchase onion starts, which were begun last year, halted, and then kept over for the coming year. And then you can do onion sets, which are little small bulbs, basically. All of those are very viable options, and they'll all give you onions. So I am in a part of the US where I have to pay particular attention to the type of onion I'm growing. This is very easily something that you can Google for your range. So there's short day onions, long day onions, and intermediate day onions. So the region I'm in, I need long day onions. Long day onions need to reach about 14 to 15 hours of daylight in order to start forming a bulb. Short day onions are for those further south. They need to reach about 10 hours of daylight for those to be able to bulb. And then there's day neutral bulbs or intermediate. Those will form bulbs regardless of the daylight hours, and they produce well in pretty much any region. So if I'm going to be growing onions over the winter and I can keep my area warm enough, I might be looking for something like intermediate day or short day onions. But for my general outdoor growing season, I am required to have long day onions. Those grow best in my area, and they can store pretty well depending on the variety. You can also do green onions or scallions or bunching onions. There's a whole bunch of different things that will give you onion flavors. What I'm going to be talking about today is the bulb onions. I can get more than one crop out of this, and what I mean by that is about halfway through the growing season, their tops get pretty sizable. So this is a separate kind of onion, but when their tops get about this big, and I cut it off about halfway, and those tops I dice up and I lay them flat on the dehydrating tray, and then I dehydrate them and I store them. Those onion greens I label as dried onion greens. These are from 2021. It's now 2023. I haven't opened this jar. We just went through another one. So they're good. If you're ever not sure, you can always do the famous sniff test when you open it, and if it smells questionable, put it away, throw it in the garbage. The dried green onions was something that was a game changer for my spouse. So my spouse does the majority of the fancy cooking in the house. I am really good at your day-to-day, throw together what we have sort of thing. If you want a fancy meal, my spouse is cooking it. So when he was cooking and he was like, well, how am I going to use these? He threw some in a meal and he was won over. He said that this is what puts a instant umami flavor in whatever meals he's putting together. So dried onion greens, additional crop to your bulbing onions. Cutting it halfway still leaves enough of the leaves for the plants to continue to grow. It's perfectly fine. And then I leave them alone the rest of the season. I can also go out and I can harvest one of these at a time, dice it up into eggs. So feel free to pick at your onions like that throughout the growing season to use what you need to. You can also start harvesting them young and they'll still have that onion flavor and smell. But if you're looking to get them to the point where you can store them, you want it to form a bulb. The reason it's important not to cut off all of the onion greens on your bulbing onions is it does need something to photosynthesize. And it's also the cue for when your plants, your onions, are ready to harvest. So the top will actually, so your bulb is down here, the top will actually tip all the way over and lay down. And that's your indicator that the onion is ready to be harvested and cured. You cure onions by leaving them in a warm, dry place, preferably with some airflow. So I tend to use my seed starting shelf that's not currently using seeds at that time, and put a fan on it, and just keep it warm and dry. The skin around the outside of the bulb will tighten up and form a pretty good seal. You don't want to peel off all those extra papery layers. The papery layers are what's going to help it stay good over the winter time. So if you are wanting to store your bulb onions, you need to first make sure that you are laying them flat, first getting them to harvest, laying them flat, and then providing adequate temperature and airflow in order for them to cure properly. If they don't cure properly, or you don't store them properly, you are losing the life expectancy of a shelf life. Like it goes away. Peeling off those papery layers also reduces an onion shelf life. You only want to peel off those papery layers when you're going to be using the onion. Once the onions are cured, then they get stored in a cool, dry, dark place. Ideally, that cool, dry, dark place needs to be between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The different varieties of onions are what's going to get you different levels of shelf life. And what I mean by that is if it'll store for 2 to 3 months, 6 to 8 months, or 10 to 12 months. And the varieties help, but your storage conditions are king. So how you're storing it is incredibly important. The variety that I've had the best luck with storage on is Yellow of Parma. The bulbing onions that I need to go through today are Yellow of Parma. Some of them have fared better than others. I honestly should have done this probably a week or two ago, maybe longer. When you see some of your onions sprouting greenery, some of your storage onions sprouting greenery, or pantry onions, that's your sign that you should be checking through. You are going to be looking for any that are wet. If they have oozed, that's not good. Essentially, the ones that you can continue to store are going to be the ones that are firm and dry, even if they've got, I don't know, dirt still on the papery skin, it's fine. The firm and dry onions are the ones that you can put back on the shelf, continue to hold those until your new ones come in for the season. Anything that's damaged, if it's completely soft, the whole bulb is soft, that gets tossed. Whether you compost or worm bin or garbage, whatever you're doing, that one goes away. You can't use that one. It is okay to use the onion greens. I've seen a lot of different questions about that online, about different articles, and they're fine. Those are ones that I chop up, dehydrate them along with my walking onions, and the ones that are partially soft, so only have like a bruise area on them. The way that I've been dealing with this is I cut off the bruised portion and then I dice up the rest of it. Any pieces that look questionable, soft, not firm, those get tossed. Any pieces that look like a normal onion does when you're prepping it for cooking and dicing it, and it's firm and it's got moisture and it looks like a good onion. Those are the pieces that I am going to dehydrate, dry them down, and then I'm going to store them in their own jar, separate from the onion greens, because I tend to use them differently. These I would use in just general cooking. The diced bulb onion pieces I would be more inclined to use in something with a lot more moisture. It's going to rehydrate those, impart some flavor to that. Probably something like stews or roasts, or yeah, probably mostly stews and roasts. So we've talked about bulbing onions. Most of you are probably familiar with bunching onions, green onions, scallions. There's a perennial onion as well, frequently referred to as Egyptian walking onions. Those are really cool. I was able to get some from the farmer's market and propagate it. So I pulled some early, so it didn't form like a very large bulb. They never really bulb like your bulbing onions, but it forms a little seed pod up top where it makes baby onions. And then as the onion dies back, then the bulbs fall to the ground and they make new onions. So it falls over and it walks across your garden. So it's a walking onion.
Yay!
The walking onions I use as needed. I use them the same way I use the onion greens. It does have a very distinct onion flavor. It's neither more or less potent, as far as I can tell, compared to the bunching onions or bulb onions. So since I have to go through my pantry onions that have sprouted anyway, I am also going to dice up the walking onions that I pulled, just to contain those borders a bit. So let's talk about the reason you would want to dehydrate something. You can certainly pickle something as well. Dehydrating tends to be my favorite way to use this because that tends to be how I cook with it. So if you are someone who uses pickled items more frequently or fermented items more frequently, maybe find an appropriate recipe for how to store things like this in that way. But the preferred method that we use in our house is with dehydrated. The jars just go up in the spice cabinet and then we use them as we need them. But the point of dehydrating is that you are removing as much moisture as you can from a vegetable, in this case, or a fruit. And by removing that moisture, you are reducing the likelihood that it will propagate bacteria. That is not to say that you are making a completely sterile thing in a jar. You aren't sanitizing it. There's not a kill step to nuke the bacteria. You're removing the water activity. Bacteria love moisture. They also love the appropriate temperatures. So if you can store your dried items in a cooler temperature area, dark, that would also help maintain the longevity of those things. The other things that are going to help you with that are working with a clean surface, clean materials, a clean knife, clean cutting board, storing it in a clean container, keeping your area sanitary as you can is a good way to ensure that you are not adding to any bacteria risks or hazards. Here's where I store my bulb onions. I know I've left this too long, and that was solidified by the idea that there's some fruit flies, which are pretty gross. So that doesn't make me happy. Might end up throwing out all of this. We'll find out. So then it's just an exercise to picking up your onions and squishing them. These are both garbage. Not good. This one is not too soft. However, he doesn't appear to have left his adventure with his friends unscathed. So I'm going to put him in my chop up pile. You can see that some of my bulbs are smaller than others. I harvested and cured them anyway, and they will still give me an onion flavor when I'm cooking. So I'm putting all of my good onions over here in this storage bin. And then I've got 2 plates where the onions I'm investigating by dicing them are going to my left. The ones that are obviously bad are going to the plate directly in front of me. given how long I've left this task, this is about what I expected. This falls under the out of sight, out of mind sort of experience, where if I don't have this in a place where I check it, I kind of forget it. So I have the bottom of this container is still full of onions, but they're all clearly bad onions. Here's my plate of other sad onions. These are my storage onions that I get to keep. Mind you, all of these were harvested at the same time. So these are from last year, 2022, stored in my basement where it was cooler and darker. And then as it shifts to summer, I kind of have to move them from the basement because then the basement is warmer than the upstairs. So I have to monitor that. Just another potential failure point in the system. So here is the plate of onions that I'm going to be dicing to dehydrate. Pieces of these will still be thrown, but not all of it. Anything that is smooshy looking needs to go. Anything that remained intact can stay. But these don't smell great, so I'm going to go toss those in the compost pile real quick. They're pretty yucky. All right, sorting complete. I put all of the onions that I will not be trying to save anything from back in this storage container, and I will take that out to the compost pile because it doesn't smell fantastic, and fruit flies are enjoying that experience, so I want to move those outside because they're yucky. But here is my plate of onions that I will be dicing up to dehydrate. First I'm going to take care of that. And then I'm going to spend some time trying not to cry while I cut onions. So I completed the task of chopping, sorting, all of that. I ended up with about equal amounts of the two things. So my Egyptian walking onions gave me about 2 trays. I did just a rough chop. I'll put those towards the bottom in the dehydrator where it'll be a little bit cooler. The fan does circulate, but heat rises. And then the onions that I went through, I also just did a rough chop. They all look like normal grocery store onions when you chop them. So I did a good job sorting. I didn't leave any mushy bits in here that would cause a contamination risk for all of its friends. So I'm going to put these towards the top of it, and I did my best to make it a thin layer so that there was enough airflow. If you have them all stacked on top of each other, they are less good at getting the airflow they need to remove the moisture from them. So these are going to go in the dehydrator. I have an Excalibur dehydrator with the settings on it labeled for vegetable and the temperatures, and then a timer. So I'm just going to use the recommended settings and let that go until it's done. And when it's done, I'll pull it out and I'll check them. And if they are in fact dry, then I will put them in jars. If they're not dry, then I will send them through another round. The other thing I'm trying is the walking onions that I had bases left. I put in water. We'll see if those develop roots and if I can grow more, because why not? So it's a couple days later, and I ran the dehydrator for, I think, 24 to 26 hours. I had these as a result. So the 2 trays of onion greens filled almost a quart jar, and then I labeled them dried onion greens 2023. Last year I used a green Sharpie on all my labels. I try to change the color each year just because it's easy for me to see at a glance how many things I have left at a given time. Not necessarily the specific items, but if I have a lot of one color of something, it means that I did not use as much as I was expecting of that, and maybe I should grow less of that in the coming years, or I should learn to incorporate that in cooking more, whichever solution you choose. But both of those are viable answers to having too much of something. And then the 2 trays of the bulb onion that got cut, dried down into this little jam jar. Similarly, I labeled this dried bulb onions 2023, same color Sharpie. And these jelly jars are really useful because this is dry product. So it doesn't need to be water bath canned or anything special. It just needs to keep the moisture out and keep the items in safe and protected. So this will go above the stove area in our seasoning rack. This is going to go on the shelf downstairs because I still have items left over from 2021 for onion greens, and I think some from 2022. So because those were put in the pantry first, I'm going to use them first. This will hang out just fine for however long it needs to, as long as I can keep it dry and in a cool, dark place. Other things you can do with your onions, your pantry onions that have sprouted and gone bad, you could potentially plant them, get some onion greens growing fresh from that. If that results in a flower stalk, that might give you onion seeds. So that's a potential good way to utilize onions that have sprouted in your pantry as well. Pickled onions are also good, especially if you do a lot of like sandwiches and burgers and things like that. If you have something that you use your sprouted onions for that I didn't mention and you think is an excellent solution, please leave that in the comments below. Thanks for coming along.